I need to tell you about something that happened to me early last spring. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about these hills in eastern Washington. Most people who hear this story think I'm crazy, but I don't care anymore. I have proof. My security camera captured images of a huge, unknown figure just hours before it broke into my remote trailer. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story really begins 6 years ago, when my best friend Mike Collins went missing in the mountains of western Oregon. Mike was experienced, 20 years of hiking under his belt. He knew those trails better than anyone. We'd hiked together since high school, but that weekend, he went solo. Said he needed to clear his head after his divorce. When he didn't check in on Sunday night, I knew something was wrong. Mike was meticulous about check-ins. Always. The search and rescue team found his campsite 3 days later, and what they described made my blood run cold. The tent was shredded, gear scattered across a 100-yard radius, his sleeping bag torn to pieces. But here's what didn't make sense. There was no blood, none, just destruction. And the footprints. I wasn't there for the initial search, but Jake Harper was. Jake had been Mike's hiking partner before I came along, back when they were both teenagers exploring those same mountains. He called me that night, and I could hear something in his voice I'd never heard before. Fear. Real fear. They're saying it was a cougar, Jake said. But I saw the prints myself before they trampled everything. 2 legs, huge. Whatever made those prints walked upright. The police closed the case within a week. Animal attack, they said. Probably a cougar, possibly a bear. Mike's body was never recovered, which they attributed to scavengers. His parents held a memorial service with an empty casket. I attended, numb and confused. But Jake didn't show up. And when I tried calling him afterward, he didn't answer. I should have known then that something had broken in him that day, in those mountains. 3 months passed before I heard from Jake again. When he finally called, he sounded different, obsessed, manic, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He wanted to meet at a diner outside Portland, said he had something to show me, something about Mike. I drove 2 hours to meet him, and the man I found barely resembled the Jake I knew. He'd lost weight, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook as he spread a collection of papers across the table between us. Old documents, photocopies of ranger logs dating back to the 1970s, newspaper clippings about missing hikers, and something else. Pages that looked like they'd been torn from a journal, covered in handwritten notes. "They're covering it up," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "All of it. Look at this." He pushed a ranger log toward me. It was from 1983, describing an incident where a family's campsite was found destroyed, their food stores gone, but no signs of the family themselves. The ranger noted, "Unusually large tracks, bipedal pattern," before the report abruptly ended with a stamped note. "Investigation concluded. Bear activity." I scanned through more documents. A 1991 incident, a 2003 case, a 2007 disappearance, all in the same general area where Mike vanished. All closed quickly with vague explanations, all mentioning destroyed campsites and missing supplies. "Jake, these could be anything," I said, trying to sound reasonable. "Bears do walk on 2 legs sometimes. People get lost in the mountains. It doesn't mean..." "Then explain these." He slid across several printed pages, stories from the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. Not official documents, but transcribed oral histories he'd found in a university archive. They spoke of the Forest Guardian, a being that walked like a man but towered over the tallest warrior, a creature that watched from the shadows and left warnings for those who ventured too deep into its territory. Though I didn't want to believe it, something about those old stories made the hair on my neck stand up. "I've been talking to people," Jake continued. Locals who won't go on record. A former park ranger who quit in '98. A search and rescue volunteer who found something in 2015 but was told to keep quiet. He leaned forward, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. There's something in those mountains, and it killed Mike. I know it did. I tried to talk him down, to convince him he was seeing patterns where none existed. Grief does that to people, makes them search for meaning in tragedy, for something to blame besides random chance. But Jake wasn't listening. He'd already made up his mind, and that's when he told me what he was planning to do. I sold my house last week, he said flatly. Put in my notice at the garage. I'm going back to those mountains, and I'm not leaving until I find it. Jake, that's insane. You can't just... I can and I will. His jaw was set, his decision made. Someone needs to know the truth about what happened to Mike. Someone needs to prove they're lying about it being an animal attack. I spent another hour trying to reason with him, but it was like talking to a wall. When we finally parted ways in that parking lot, I had a sick feeling in my stomach that I'd never see Jake Harper again. At least, not the Jake I used to know. And I was right about that, though not in the way I expected. For the next 8 months, I heard nothing from Jake. I tried calling a few times, but his number had been disconnected. I reached out to mutual friends, but no one had seen him. It was like he'd vanished into those mountains just like Mike had. Part of me wondered if I should report him missing. But what would I even say? That my friend went looking for Bigfoot and didn't come back? Then, in late November, I got an email. No subject line, sent from an address I didn't recognize. Just a link to a cloud storage folder and a single sentence. I found the tower. I'm setting up. Don't tell anyone. The folder contained photos, dozens of them. An abandoned fire lookout tower deep in the forest, its windows broken, its stairs rusted but intact. Interior shots showing Jake's setup, a camping cot, propane heater, plastic bins of supplies, and equipment. So much equipment. Trail cameras mounted on trees, what looked like motion sensors in weatherproof cases, a laptop with multiple external hard drives, a large topographic map pinned to the wall, covered in marks and annotations I couldn't decipher from the photo. He'd actually done it. Jake had turned himself into a one-man research station in the middle of nowhere. I should have tried harder to stop him. Should have driven out there, found that tower, dragged him back to civilization. But I didn't. Maybe I was too busy with my own life, or maybe some part of me was curious about what he might find. Either way, I just sent back a short reply. Be careful. Check in regularly. He did check in, at first. Brief emails every week or two. Nothing yet. Installed new cameras on the North Ridge. Heard something last night but couldn't get a visual. The messages were terse, factual, almost mechanical. But at least they kept coming. Proof that Jake was still alive out there. Then the tone started to change. Equipment malfunction on Sector 3. All 4 cameras dead, batteries drained, even though I just replaced them 2 days ago. Something took the food I left out. Not bears, wrong time of year, and they'd have torn through the containers. These were opened carefully, lids removed and stacked beside them. Found marks in the snow near the tower. Broken branches arranged in a pattern, almost like a symbol. Taking photos. I told myself it was nothing. Animals could be surprisingly clever. Equipment failed in harsh conditions. Jake was probably seeing patterns again, finding meaning where there was only coincidence and nature. But something about that last email bothered me. The part about the symbol. I opened the attached photos, and even though I had no idea what I was looking at, something about those deliberately arranged branches made my skin crawl. 3 weeks passed with no word. I sent multiple emails. No response. I was seriously considering calling the authorities when a new message arrived. Just 2 lines. It knows I'm here. Last night, it was hitting the tower. That was it. No elaboration, no follow-up. And when I immediately wrote back asking what he meant, my email bounced. His account had been deleted or disabled. I didn't sleep well that night. Kept thinking about Jake, alone in that tower. Something circling outside in the darkness. Metal ringing as something struck the structure. What would make that kind of sound? Why would any animal deliberately hit a metal tower? Unless it wasn't an animal. Unless Jake had been right all along. 2 more weeks of silence. Then, in mid-January, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Oregon area code. When I answered, a woman's voice asked if I knew Jacob Harper. "I'm with the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office," she said. "We need you to come identify some belongings we found." My heart dropped. Did you find him?" There was a pause, and in that pause, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. "We found his vehicle and some of his equipment," she said carefully. "But Mr. Harper himself is still missing." I made the drive to Oregon in a daze, my mind cycling through worst-case scenarios. The sheriff's deputy who met me at the station was professional but guarded, the way cops get when a case doesn't make sense. She led me to a room where Jake's belongings were laid out on a table. His wallet, keys, a waterproof journal, and one of his external hard drives.
"We found his truck at a trailhead about 15 miles from the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest boundary," she explained. "Anonymous hiker called it in, said it had been there for weeks. When we investigated, we found the trail to an old fire lookout tower. The tower itself was..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Damaged." "Damaged how?" "The ladder had been torn away from the structure. Not rusted through, torn. Like something ripped it off with considerable force." She watched my reaction closely. "We found climbing rope tied to the platform railing, like someone had tried to rappel down. There was blood on the rope, and at the base of the tower. Not a lot, but enough." My stomach turned. "How much blood?" "Consistent with a fall injury, possibly a broken bone. But here's the thing. We tracked the blood trail for about 200 yards into the forest, and then it just stopped. No body, no additional signs of struggle, just gone." She slid the journal across the table to me. "This was in his truck. We've read through it, but maybe you can make sense of some of it. A lot of it is..." She trailed off, clearly unsure how to describe what she'd read. I opened the journal. The early entries were methodical. Dates, times, sensor readings, camera positions. Jake documenting his daily routine like a proper researcher. But as I flipped forward, the handwriting became more erratic, the entries less organized. December 3. Cameras 7, 8, and 12 all corrupted. Same pattern as before. Files are there but won't open, like something interfered with the recording mid-capture. December 8th. It's playing with me. Has to be. Food storage containers opened again, but this time it only took specific items. Left the canned goods, took all the dried fruit and nuts. How does it know the difference? December 15th. The symbols are getting closer to the tower. Found another one this morning, maybe 50 yards out. Branches and stones arranged in that same pattern. I think it's a warning. December 22nd. Heard it again last night. Not just hitting the tower, it's rhythmic. 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, pause, repeat. That's not random. That's deliberate communication. Then came an entry that made my blood run cold. December 29. Got something on camera 4. Finally. Massive silhouette at the edge of the frame, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Bipedal. Watched it for maybe 10 seconds before it moved out of frame. Went to check the footage this morning, and the file is corrupted, just like the others. But this time, I swear I can make out a shape in the static, just a shadow, like it left its imprint on purpose, like it wants me to know it's there, but won't let me prove it. This thing is intelligent, far more intelligent than I gave it credit for. I looked up at the deputy. "Did you find camera 4? She nodded grimly. The SD card was destroyed, snapped in half. All the other cameras in the area had been disabled too, lenses covered with mud, deliberately. Whatever happened out there, someone or something didn't want it recorded." "You keep saying something," I said. "You don't think a person did this?" She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her weighing how much to tell me. "Off the record? The force required to tear that ladder off the tower. We're talking about steel bolts ripped straight through metal brackets. I've never seen anything like it. And the footprints we found near the base of the tower before the recent snow covered them." She shook her head. "Look, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know what bear prints look like, what elk tracks look like, what human boot treads look like. These were none of those things." She pulled out a photo from a folder and slid it across to me. It showed a single footprint in mud, and even in the photo, I could see it was massive, easily 18 inches long, humanoid in shape, but wrong somehow. Too wide, the toe impressions too pronounced. "We're treating this as a missing person case," she continued. "But between you and me, I don't think your friend fell and wandered off injured. I think something happened up in that tower, something that scared him enough to try climbing down a rope with a broken leg. The question is, what?" I stared at that footprint, and for the first time I understood why Jake had become so obsessed. Because now I was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that official reports would explain away as a bear or a hoax or stress-induced delusion. But I knew what I was seeing, and I knew Jake had been right. The deputy let me take the journal and the hard drive, said they'd already documented everything, and I might find something useful they'd missed. I drove to a motel that night but couldn't sleep. Just kept reading through Jake's entries, watching his transformation from methodical researcher to something closer to obsessed prey. There was one entry near the end, dated January 4th, that I must have read a dozen times. I understand now what Mike must have felt in those final moments. The isolation, the creeping certainty that you're being watched by something that exists outside the normal rules. I came here hunting for a creature, something I could expose and prove. But this thing isn't just avoiding me, it's studying me, learning my patterns. It knows when I check the cameras, knows when I sleep. I find evidence of it circling the tower at night, prints in the snow that weren't there at sunset. It's treating me the same way a scientist treats a lab rat, and I'm starting to think that's exactly what I am to it. The final entry was dated January 11th, just 3 days before he must have fallen. The spring melt is starting early. Creek below the tower is flooding. I can hear it from here, getting louder every day. Something's changed in the pattern. The creature isn't just circling anymore, it's getting closer. Last night I heard it on the stairs, the metal groaning under weight. I shined my flashlight down and saw nothing, but I know it was there. I could feel it watching. Going to reinforce the ladder bolts tomorrow. If this thing decides it wants in, I don't think the tower will stop it. But he never got the chance to reinforce anything, because the next time anyone saw that tower, the ladder was torn away and Jake was gone. I spent the next day trying to access the hard drive, but most of the files were corrupted, just like Jake had described. Random fragments of footage, a branch swaying in wind, deer passing through frame, hours of empty forest. Whatever Jake had captured, whatever had convinced him in those final weeks, was locked in corrupted data I couldn't retrieve. Then I found one file that opened, dated January 10th, timestamp showing 2:47 a.m. The footage was grainy, shot in night vision mode from one of his cameras. For the first 30 seconds,
Nothing but trees and darkness. Then, movement at the edge of frame. Something massive stepped partially into view. The night vision washed out details, turning everything into shades of green and black. But I could make out a silhouette. Broad shoulders, a head that seemed slightly too large, arms that hung past where human arms should end. It stood at the edge of the camera's range, perfectly still, almost like it knew exactly where the camera's boundary was. Then it turned its head toward the lens. I couldn't make out features, but I had the unmistakable impression it was looking directly at the camera. Directly at Jake. For maybe 5 seconds it held that pose, and then it stepped backward into the darkness and was gone. The footage continued for another 2 minutes, showing nothing but empty forest. Then the file corrupted mid-playback, the image fragmenting into digital noise before the player crashed entirely. I tried to reopen it, but the file was damaged now, refusing to load. Just like Jake had described, as if the creature somehow knew how to leave just enough evidence to torment, but never enough to prove. That's when I made my decision. I called my girlfriend and told her I needed to take a few personal days. Packed a bag, bought a detailed topographic map and marking Jake's tower location based on the coordinates in his journal. If the sheriff's department had given up the search, then I'd go myself. I owed Jake that much. Owed Mike, too. Looking back now, I can see how stupid that decision was. How arrogant. I thought I was being loyal, being brave. I didn't understand that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved by amateurs with good intentions. Didn't understand that Jake's story was a warning, not an invitation. But I loaded my truck with camping gear, a hunting rifle I barely knew how to use, and enough supplies for a week. Told myself I'd hike to that tower, search the area the cops had missed, find something, anything, that would tell me what happened to my friend. I thought I was the hunter heading into those mountains. Thought I was in control. I wasn't. And the moment I stepped onto that trail, something began watching me with the same patient attention it had given Jake. Though I wouldn't realize that until much later, when it was already too late to turn back. The hike to the tower took most of a day. The trail had been easy to follow at first, marked and maintained, but after about 5 miles, it deteriorated into something barely recognizable. Jake's journal had included rough directions, and I matched them against my GPS, pushing through underbrush that clearly hadn't seen human traffic in months. I found the tower just before sunset. It rose above the tree line like a skeleton, its metal frame orange with rust, windows dark and empty. The latter situation was even worse than the deputy had described. It hadn't just been torn away. The metal had been twisted, bolts sheared off with such force that the brackets themselves had bent. I'm a mechanic by trade, and I know what kind of stress metal can take. Whatever did this had strength that shouldn't exist in nature. The climbing rope was still there, tied to the platform railing 30 feet above. Dried blood stained the knot and streaked down the first few feet of rope. I stood at the base of the tower and tried to imagine Jake's desperation. Injured, trapped, something below that had just destroyed his only exit. What do you do in that moment? What choice do you have except to climb down and hope? I made camp about 50 yards from the tower, close enough to investigate in the morning, but not so close that I'd be sleeping directly under it. As I set up my tent, I kept glancing at the forest around me, feeling that prickling sensation of being watched. Probably just nerves, I told myself. Just the isolation and the knowledge of what had happened here playing tricks on my mind. But as darkness fell, that feeling intensified. I sat by my small campfire, forcing myself to eat, and listened to the forest. Normal sounds at first. Wind in the trees, the distant rush of the swollen creek Jake had mentioned. Then, around 9 o'clock, something changed.
The normal background noise seemed to diminish, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that silence. It's what happens when a predator is near, and every small creature goes still, hoping not to be noticed. I added more wood to the fire and kept my rifle close. Told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something just beyond the firelight was observing me with the same clinical interest Jake had described in his journal. Around midnight, I heard it. A sound like metal striking metal, echoing across the darkness. 3 strikes. Pause. 2 strikes. Pause. The exact pattern Jake had written about. It was coming from the direction of the tower. My hands shook as I grabbed my flashlight and rifle. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in my tent, to hide, but I forced myself to move toward the sound. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the tower's base, the twisted ladder, the rope swaying slightly in the breeze. Nothing there. No movement. No sign of what had made that sound. Then I heard it again, closer this time. 3 strikes, 2 strikes. But now I could tell it wasn't coming from the tower. It was coming from the forest to my right. Like whatever made the sound had moved, like it was circling. I spun toward the noise, rifle raised, flashlight beam dancing across tree trunks. "I know you're there," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Show yourself." Silence. Just the pounding of my heart and the ragged sound of my breathing. Then, from behind me, so close I felt the vibration in my chest, 3 metallic strikes. Something had gotten between me and my camp. I wheeled around, and for just a second, my flashlight caught something at the very edge of its beam. A shape. Tall. Moving between trees with impossible silence for something that size. I fired the rifle. The shot cracked through the night, deafening, and I worked the bolt, ready to fire again. But there was nothing to shoot at. Whatever I'd seen, if I'd seen anything at all, was gone. I didn't sleep that night, just sat by my fire with the rifle across my lap, feeding wood to the flames until dawn, jumping at every sound. As gray light finally seeped through the trees, I started to doubt what I'd experienced. Maybe it had been an elk, or my exhausted mind playing tricks. Maybe the metallic sound had been the tower settling, branches hitting metal, something mundane that fear had transformed into a threat. But when I finally worked up the courage to check the perimeter of my camp, I found them. Footprints in the soft earth near the creek. The same impossible prints from the deputy's photo, fresh and clear. They circled my campsite in a wide arc, coming within maybe 20 feet at the closest point. It had been watching me all night. Close enough to rush my camp at any moment. Close enough to kill me while I sat paralyzed by that fire. But it hadn't. And I didn't know if that made me feel better or worse. I should have left right then, packed up my gear and hiked back to civilization while I still could. But something kept me there. Maybe stubbornness, maybe the need to understand what Jake had gone through, or maybe just the terrible fascination of knowing I was close to something that shouldn't exist. I spent the morning searching the area around the tower, following the same trails Jake must have walked dozens of times. I found more of those branch symbols he'd photographed, arranged in clearings like deliberate markers. Up close, they were even more unsettling. Too precise to be random, too purposeful to dismiss as natural debris. Someone or something had placed each branch with intention. Around noon, I discovered Jake's motion sensors, still mounted on trees, but disabled exactly as he'd described. Lenses covered with mud, applied carefully, almost gently. Not smashed or torn down, just blinded. It reminded me of a child covering their eyes during hide and seek, except this was a creature intelligent enough to understand what a camera was,
and how to neutralize it without destroying it. That thought terrified me more than the footprints had. I found the food containers next, stacked neatly beside a fallen log, about a quarter mile from the tower. Just like Jake had written, the lids had been removed and set aside, not torn or chewed. Inside one container, I found a scrap of paper weighted down with a stone, one of Jake's notes to himself. Day 47, testing intelligence, leaving varied food items. So Jake had been conducting experiments, trying to prove the creature could differentiate between food types, could problem solve, could think. And based on what I was seeing, he'd succeeded. Whatever this thing was, it had understood it was being tested and had played along. The implications of that made my skin crawl. I was heading back toward camp when the weather turned. The spring melt Jake had mentioned in his journal had made the creek swell to 3 times its normal size, and now dark clouds were rolling in from the west. Within 20 minutes, rain was falling in sheets, and I could hear the creek's roar intensifying. I made it back to the tower just as the storm really hit. My tent wouldn't survive this kind of wind and rain, so I did the only thing I could. I grabbed my gear and looked up at that platform 30 feet above me. The rope was still there, Jake's blood long since washed away by previous storms. I tested it, found it secure, and started climbing. My arms burned by the time I hauled myself onto the platform, rain stinging my face, wind threatening to tear me loose. I scrambled through the trapdoor and into the tower's interior, gasping, soaked through. Jake's setup was still here. The cot, now covered in bird droppings and debris. The propane heater, empty. The map on the wall, faded but still visible, covered in annotations I couldn't read in the dim light. And equipment. So much damaged equipment. Cameras with cracked lenses, the laptop ruined by weather. External hard drives scattered across the floor. I caught my breath and looked around, trying to see this place through Jake's eyes. 4 walls of windows, giving a 360 view of the forest. Nowhere to hide. Nowhere something couldn't see you from outside. I imagined him up here night after night, watching the tree line, knowing something was watching back. The storm intensified. Lightning cracked across the sky, thunder following seconds later. I pulled Jake's sleeping bag from the storage bin, musty but dry, and tried to make myself comfortable while I waited out the weather. This was temporary, I told myself, just until the storm passed. Then I'd climb down and hike out and never come back to this place. But around 3 in the afternoon, I heard a sound that changed everything. A deep groan of metal under stress, then a screech of bolts tearing free. I rushed to the window and looked down. The flooding creek had undermined the tower's foundation. One of the support legs had shifted, tilting the entire structure at a slight angle. As I watched in horror, another leg buckled slightly, and the tower lurched. I grabbed for the rope, thinking I could climb down before the whole thing collapsed. But when I looked over the edge, my stomach dropped. The rope was gone. In the chaos of the storm, I hadn't noticed. The line had come untied or been pulled free, and now it lay in the mud 30 feet below, completely out of reach. I was trapped, just like Jake had been. The tower groaned again, metal screaming as another support buckled. I had maybe minutes before this whole structure came down, and there was no way out. The platform was too high to jump without breaking both legs. The ladder was destroyed, and the rope was gone. That's when I saw it. Movement in the tree line, barely visible through the rain. A massive silhouette, standing perfectly still, watching the tower, watching me. It had been waiting for this, waiting for me to be vulnerable, trapped, helpless. And now that I was, It just stood there in the rain, observing. Like I was the experiment now. The tower lurched again, and I lost my footing, slamming hard against the wall. Through the window, I could still see that silhouette, unmoving in the downpour. It was close enough now that I could make out more details: the width of its shoulders, the way it stood slightly hunched, arms hanging long at its sides,
watching me with what felt like patient curiosity as my shelter threatened to collapse. I had seconds to make a decision. Stay here and ride the tower down, probably breaking my neck in the fall, or try to climb down the outside framework and hope I could reach the ground before the structure gave way completely. Neither option was good, but at least climbing gave me a chance. I grabbed what I could, my knife, Jake's journal from my pack, and stuffed them in my jacket. Then I squeezed through one of the broken windows and onto the external framework. The metal was slick with rain, rust flaking off under my grip. I started descending, moving as fast as I dared, trying not to think about the 30-foot drop or the creature watching from the trees. I made it maybe 15 feet when my boot slipped. I scrabbled for purchase, fingers closing around a crossbeam, but my weight shifted wrong and I felt my grip failing. The metal groaned. Everything seemed to slow down. I could see the ground rushing up, could already feel the impact that was coming. Then I fell. I hit hard, my left leg buckling under me with a crack I felt more than heard. Pain exploded up my thigh, and I screamed, rolling in the mud, vision going white. Through the haze of agony, I heard the tower collapse behind me, metal shrieking as the entire structure came down in a cascade of rust and broken framework. I don't know how long I lay there. Minutes, maybe longer. The pain was overwhelming, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. My leg was definitely broken. I could feel the wrongness of it, the way the bone had shifted. When I finally managed to look down, I saw my shin bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. Rain poured down on my face. I was going to die here. That thought came with strange clarity. I was miles from help, couldn't walk, couldn't even stand. The storm would continue through the night. Hypothermia would set in, and by morning, I'd just be another missing person case the sheriff's department would eventually close. That's when I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving through the mud toward me. I tried to sit up, to reach for my knife, but the pain made everything gray out. When my vision cleared, the creature was standing over me. I could finally see it clearly, and my mind struggled to process what I was looking at. It was massive, had to be close to 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, matted with rain. The face was wrong, not quite ape, not quite human, something in between that shouldn't exist in any taxonomy I knew. But it was the eyes that froze me. Dark, intelligent eyes that held none of the blank animal stare I expected. They looked at me with something that might have been recognition, or pity. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, me broken and helpless in the mud, this impossible creature towering above me. I waited for it to kill me, to finish whatever it had started with Mike and Jake. But it didn't move, just stood there, studying me as rain poured down around us. Then, slowly, it crouched down. I flinched, certain this was the end, but it didn't reach for me. Instead, it looked at my broken leg, tilted its head slightly, and made a sound, low, almost contemplative. Not a growl, not aggressive, just thinking. It stood and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I lay there, confused, terrified, not understanding what had just happened. Was it getting others? Coming back to finish me? My mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Then I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, everything was dark. When I woke, I wasn't in the rain anymore. I was lying on something dry, stone, I thought, though I couldn't see much. Darkness pressed in from all sides, broken only by dim light filtering in from somewhere above. The air smelled of earth and mineral, and I could hear water dripping in the distance. A cave, or a mine, somewhere underground. My leg still screamed with pain, but when I felt it carefully, I realized something had been done to it. Straight branches had been bound along the length of my shin, a crude splint, but effective. My jacket had been removed and folded under my head like a pillow, and beside me sat a plastic water bottle and several energy bars from my pack, arranged neatly on a flat rock. Someone had treated my injury, had carried me here, had left me supplies. In the darkness, I could feel it again, that sense of being watched, not with malice, but with that same patient attention, like I was still the subject of some vast, incomprehensible experiment, and the creature was waiting to see what I would do next. "Hello?" My voice came out as a croak, echoing in the darkness. No response. Just the steady drip of water and my own ragged breathing. But I knew I wasn't alone. Knew something was there in the shadows, maintaining its vigil. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't feel afraid anymore. Just deeply, profoundly confused. I spent what must have been days in that cave, drifting in and out of consciousness. Fever set in from the broken leg, making time feel elastic and strange. Sometimes I'd wake to find fresh water and food beside me. Granola bars, dried fruit, things that must have come from other hikers' abandoned supplies. Once I woke to find my forehead cool and damp, like something had placed a wet cloth there, though when I reached up, there was nothing. The creature never showed itself while I was conscious, but I knew it was there, checking on me, keeping me alive. I could hear it sometimes in the deeper darkness, careful footsteps, the sound of something large moving with surprising gentleness. Once, delirious with fever, I thought I heard it making those same rhythmic sounds Jake had described. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, like it was communicating something I didn't have the capacity to understand. On what I think was the 3rd day, the fever broke. I woke clear-headed for the first time, and in the dim light filtering from above, I could finally see where I was. An old mine shaft, partially collapsed but stable. The entrance was maybe 20 feet away, a slope of loose rock I'd never be able to climb with my leg. But I could see daylight, could see trees beyond, and that gave me hope that I wouldn't die in the dark. That's when I noticed the marks on the wall near me. Scratches in the stone, deliberate and purposeful. I pulled myself closer, my splinted leg dragging, and studied them. They were crude but unmistakable, pictographs maybe, or a written language I didn't recognize. Some looked fresh, others weathered and old, like this place had been used for, what? Communication? Record keeping? The implications made my head spin. This wasn't just some animal following instinct. This was a being with culture, with the capacity for symbolic thought, with intelligence that rivaled or exceeded human cognition. And it had chosen to save me rather than let me die. But why? I heard movement outside the cave entrance, slow, deliberate steps. Then a massive shape blocked out some of the light as the creature appeared at the opening. It was carrying something, a bundle wrapped in what looked like torn fabric. It descended the slope with surprising grace, moving sideways to accommodate the narrow passage, and stopped about 10 feet from where I lay. We looked at each other. In better light, I could see its features more clearly. The face was deeply lined, suggesting age, and there was a scar across one shoulder, old, long-healed. This wasn't just any member of its species. This was an individual, with a history, with experiences that had shaped it. It set the bundle down and pushed it toward me with one long arm, then retreated to the cave entrance. I waited until it had settled into a watching position before I pulled the bundle closer and unwrapped it. Inside was a torn backpack. Mike's backpack. I recognized the patches he'd sewn on, the carabiner with his keys still attached. My hands shook as I went through the contents. A crushed water bottle, a shredded jacket, a camping knife with a broken tip. And beneath those, carefully wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from moisture, Mike's wallet with his driver's license still inside. But it was what else was in the bundle that made me understand. Bones. Not all of them, but enough. Ribs showing deep scoring marks. A fragment of skull with puncture wounds. The distinctive damage pattern of a large predator, a bear most likely, given the size and spacing of the teeth marks. The creature made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and gestured toward the bones with one massive hand. Then it pointed outside, to the forest beyond. I didn't need language to understand what it was telling me. Mike hadn't been killed by this creature. He'd been killed by a bear, just like the police had said. And this being had found the remains afterward, had tried to protect them, had driven away scavengers, and arranged what was left in some approximation of respect. I looked up at the creature with new eyes. "You tried to help him," I said quietly. "You couldn't save him, so you did what you could." It didn't respond. Couldn't, maybe, if it lacked human vocal cords. But something in its posture seemed to relax slightly, like it understood it had been recognized. Not as a monster, but as something else entirely. Over the next few hours, as my strength returned, it began showing me more. It led me, moving slowly so I could drag myself along, deeper into the cave system, to a natural chamber where other bundles were stored. Torn clothes, damaged equipment, personal effects from hikers who'd died in these mountains over the years, collected and preserved with what looked like reverence. This creature had been finding human remains for decades, protecting them from animals, keeping vigil over the dead. Not a monster, a guardian. Then it led me to one final place, a small alcove where branches and stones had been arranged around Mike's camping gear. A memorial, crude but unmistakable in its intent. This being had understood loss, had felt something when it found Mike's body, had created a space to honor a stranger's death. I sat there for a long time, crying for Mike, for Jake, for all the years spent chasing the wrong truth. Jake had been so convinced this creature was a killer that he'd never considered it might be the opposite. Something that tried to help, that mourned our dead, that had watched over this forest and the humans who wandered through it with a protective patience we'd never recognized. The creature sat with me while I wept, maintaining its quiet vigil. And when I finally looked up, exhausted and wrung out, it stood and gestured toward the cave entrance, toward the world outside. It was time to leave. And somehow I knew it was going to help me get home. Getting out of those mountains took 2 days. The creature, I'd stopped thinking of it as it and started thinking of it as them, though I had no idea if that was right. Fashioned a travois from branches and dragged me through the forest. They moved only at dusk and dawn, staying in dense cover, avoiding any trails where we might encounter other hikers. Protecting their secret, even while saving my life. We never spoke. Couldn't, really. But there was communication in the careful way they adjusted the travois when I winced in pain, in the way they stopped near streams so I could drink, in the deliberate route they chose that avoided the steepest terrain. This was intelligence, compassion, care given freely to a member of a species that had hunted and feared them for generations. On the second evening, they brought me to the edge of a logging road, about a mile from where I'd left my truck. They set me down gently, arranged my pack within reach, and then stepped back into the shadows. I tried to thank them, stumbled over words that felt inadequate. They just stood there, watching,
that same patient observation I'd come to recognize. Then they did something I'll never forget. They raised one massive hand, not in threat, but in what looked unmistakably like a wave, a gesture of farewell, of acknowledgement. And then they turned and disappeared into the forest, moving with silence that something that large shouldn't possess. I never saw them again. A logging crew found me the next morning and called for emergency services. I told the paramedics I'd fallen, broken my leg, managed to crawl to the road. They seemed skeptical of the splint's construction, but didn't push. The sheriff's deputy who'd shown me Jake's belongings visited me in the hospital, asked careful questions about what I'd found up there. I told her I'd searched the tower, hadn't found Jake, had gotten caught in the storm and injured in the tower's collapse. All true, technically. I didn't mention the creature, the cave, the memorial. Some truths aren't meant for official reports. "We're going to keep the case open," she said. "But between us, after this much time..." She didn't need to finish. Jake was gone, presumably dead. Another person lost to those mountains. They'd search a while longer, then quietly close the file. I thought about telling her everything, about showing her the photos on my phone of those pictographs in the cave, of Mike's memorial, of the impossible footprints I'd documented. But then I thought about what would happen if I did. Expeditions, researchers, hunters wanting proof or wanting a trophy, media attention turning those quiet mountains into a circus. And I thought about that creature, that being, who'd spent decades protecting the dead, maintaining their lonely vigil, asking nothing in return, who'd saved my life when they could have let me die, who deserved better than to become a spectacle, a target, a specimen in someone's lab. So I kept quiet. Told the deputy I hadn't found anything unusual. Let her close her notebook with a sigh of frustration at another dead end. Now, months later, I'm back home and still thinking about those days in the cave. I dream sometimes about Mike's memorial, about Jake's corrupted camera footage, about intelligent eyes watching me from the darkness with something that might have been trust. And you know what haunts me most? The realization that Jake spent his final weeks hunting something that might have tried to help him if he'd only understood what he was looking at. If you've stayed with me this long, listening to this whole story, I need you to understand something. I'm telling you this not for attention, not to convince you these beings exist, but because I think we owe them something. We owe them the dignity of being left alone, the respect of keeping their secret. So before I finish, I have two requests. First, if this story meant something to you, if it made you think differently about what might be out there in the wild places, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone you trust, someone who understands that some mysteries deserve to remain mysteries. Leave a comment telling me what you think, but think carefully about what you'd do if you were in my position. Would you expose them, or would you protect them? And second, more important, if you ever find yourself in the mountains and you see something you can't explain, something watching from the trees with eyes too intelligent to be animal, something that leaves symbols in the snow or footprints too large to be human, just walk away. Don't follow it. Don't try to prove it exists. Don't do what Jake did. Some beings don't want to be found, and maybe, just maybe, they've earned the right to their privacy. I still have Mike's wallet, kept in a drawer I rarely open. I returned it to his parents, told them I'd found it near the tower, that it confirmed what the police had said about a bear attack. They cried and thanked me for giving them closure. I didn't tell them about the memorial, about the creature that had honored their son's death in the only way it knew how. Jake's journal sits on my bookshelf. Sometimes I flip through it, reading his descent from researcher to obsessed hunter. And I wonder what would have happened if he'd approached them differently. If he'd tried to communicate instead of capture. If he'd offered respect instead of demanding proof. Would they have revealed themselves?
Would they have let him into their world? Or are some boundaries meant to remain uncrossed, some distances meant to stay permanent? I don't know. I'll never know. What I do know is this. There are things in those mountains that science hasn't cataloged, that cameras can't capture, that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we're meant to understand. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is acknowledge their existence and then walk away, letting them keep their secrets. That's what I've chosen to do. And if you ask me whether they're real, whether any of this actually happened, I'll just smile and suggest you take a hike in the deep woods sometime. Pay attention to the shadows. Notice when the forest goes quiet. Look for symbols in the snow. And if you see something watching back, something that shouldn't exist but does, remember what I told you. Just walk away. Some legends deserve to stay legends, and some guardians deserve to remain hidden, doing their quiet work in the dark spaces of the world, protecting the lost and honoring the dead in ways we're only beginning to understand.